Welcome everyone to the webinar on trends in comprehensive school safety related policies in the Asia Pacific region. My name's Kate McFarlane and I'm a research advisor with Save the Children, and I'm joined here today by Dr. Rebecca Pachi-Green from Risk Red, who I'll introduce shortly. On behalf of the Global Alliance for Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience in the Education Sector, also known as GADRES, Save the Children and Risk Red are presenting this webinar as part of the webinar series on urban child-centred DRR and comprehensive school safety. This research is supported by the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery, also known as GFDRR, CNA Foundation, CNA and Save the Children Switzerland. Before we kick off, just a little bit of housekeeping. You'll see on the left-hand side of your screen there's an instant messaging box. Feel free to use this throughout the webinar, and we'll try and address your questions as they come up, but if not, we will answer them at the end of the webinar. The webinar presentation will go for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and then we have the remainder of the time for questions. And those who would like to stay and discuss things can stick around, because Dr. Rebecca Pachi-Green has kindly offered to stay on an extra 30 minutes to keep those discussions going. And just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared. Before we begin, just so we know who's on the call, in the instant messenger box, would you mind just writing your name, the organisation you're joining from, and the country which you're calling from? So while you're doing that, I'll just provide a little bit of context to the research program. In 2016, Save the Children conducted a scoping study looking at the gaps in child-centred disaster risk reduction and comprehensive school safety evidence and guidance. And from that research, we found three broad themes in the gaps, and you can see them up on the screen there. There's policy, advocacy, and the enabling environment, and that's the theme which this research topic today falls under. There's impacts of hazards on education and solutions for child-centred disaster risk reduction and comprehensive school safety. So I'll let you read through them in your own time. Also, Save the Children is working with GADRES members and school safety partners to develop a research roadmap for child-centred disaster risk reduction and comprehensive school safety, which will continue on after this research program. You can see that under each theme, there's a number of research topics. There's also some cross-cutting research topics. We're going to share the research findings from the program through a number of different knowledge products. So there are research reports, research summary reports, implementation tools, presentations, and research into practice briefs. And now they're concise literature reviews of research findings and best practice in discrete topic areas relevant to program development and implementation. So topics such as school drills, disaster risk reduction and inclusion, and gender. We have 14 so far, with many more planned to come. There's also an online free shared bibliography of comprehensive school safety and child-centred disaster risk reduction references, and all will be available on the website. So the research findings are starting to emerge and will be ready in May, and again they'll be on the GADRIS website. But returning to the research topic of today, trends in comprehensive school safety related policies in the Asia Pacific region, why is it so important? Well, for us it's so important because children are typically represent 60% of the affected population in disasters. Not only are they at risk of death and injury, but their right to a basic quality education is threatened in the duration and aftermath of a disaster. Disaster risk reduction measures in the education sector is emerging as an important priority to safeguard education sector investments, and applying the comprehensive school safety framework. All of these measures should begin with creating an enabling environment, which is largely associated with policy development and implementation. The focus on the Asia Pacific is because it is the most disaster-prone region in the world. The purpose of this research was to identify themes in comprehensive school safety related policies in the Asia Pacific region, identify factors that facilitate or block the development and implementation of comprehensive school safety related policies, provide recommendations for developing and implementing comprehensive school safety related policies based on identified themes and policy facilitators and blockers. At this point, I would like to hand over to Dr. Rebecca Pachi-Green. Dr. Rebecca Pachi-Green is the Interim Director of RiskRed and Assistant Professor at Western Washington University. Thank you for joining us today, Rebecca.
Hello. I hope everyone can hear me. And I hope that my pushing the slides forward will advance them for everyone. Let me know if that's not true. I'm moving on to the first slide. So we've been looking at the existing state of comprehensive school safety policy, which I'm going to use the acronym CSS probably most of the time in reference to comprehensive school safety. And as Kate said, we looked first at the Asia Pacific region. We are, I will explain at the end, we are expanding out and now looking more globally. But we think it's really important to look at this policy and policy implementation, starting first by looking at what policy development and implementation looks like, sort of in the theoretical sense. So policy is really the process of defining and creating a desirable community change. Policymakers lay out a specific vision of what should exist, and then they outline the behavior that will lead to that vision. That said, there's really two distinct types of policy creation. There's the process of emergent policy, and then there's a top-down policy development process. Emergent policy evolves out of common practices and traditions and the way things are done within a community. These are often not written, or if they are written, they're often very informal, and they may describe procedures of an organization or steps or guidelines for a community, perhaps with some sanctioning involved, but not full-fledged written policies. On the other side, we've got the top-down policies. Those are generally made by policymakers who are defining a vision of how things ought to be through written documents. Generally, these processes are often working together, and emergent demand from the bottom leads to an awareness of an issue at the top and a top-down policy formation. Policy implementation, on the other hand, is the process of taking that vision and making it a reality on the ground. In that implementation process, practitioners become a mediator of sorts, mediating between the top-down vision and the practices of the local community. When formal government policy is being developed or organizational policy is being developed, such as the development of national CSS policies that we looked at in this study, the process itself can have two different styles. There's a top-down policy development process, and there's a participatory policy process. In the top-down policy development process, the policy makers are usually an external to the community itself, such as a government or an NGO, and they form a vision and identify the strategies for encouraging the desired behavior. In that process, the practitioners are critically important. They provide information regarding the nature of the problem and possible solutions. They encourage innovation during the implementation, because never has there been a policy written that was implemented first and perfectly the first time. They help evaluate the policy in light of what's actually happening at the community level, and they help ensure community representation in that process. So they're facilitating the learning process of the community and the government. That said, even when practitioners are playing these roles and doing a good job at these roles, that top-down policy process is not easy and often not the best approach. As many of you know quite well, communities tend to change only when there's a majority that deem it necessary, and they tend to resist change when they perceive it as being imposed from the outside, especially when the policy vision is really different from the emergent practices in the community. The top-down policy implementation process is challenging. On the other hand, the participatory approach more closely mirrors how emergent policy forms, and it's the direction that many policymakers are going today. This process is one where stakeholders work together to develop the goals and strategies appropriate for their community, and the whole process better respects the community's ability to make its own decisions and can help prevent the community from becoming resistant to the change or dependent on external assistance. Both processes are still widely used. That said, many well-intentioned top-down policies have failed when they don't account for local culture. As a result, many policymakers are shifting more towards that participatory process, where the practitioners are playing a role of facilitator and facilitating the visioning process, bringing together a bunch of experts and with local expertise and professional networks, and mediating between those competing groups in communities and empowering those marginalized voices, which is all much easier said than done. We'll see a lot of these processes when we start looking at the case studies of CSS policy implementation. But first, let's look at the baseline survey that was done globally, but in particular in the Asia-Pacific region. As Kate noted, the funding was through GFDRR and the CNA Foundation, and it was looking at comprehensive school safety as a baseline. And this is the first real global baseline we have of what kind of CSS policies actually exist in countries around the globe. And at the same time, we were also doing 10 case studies to look into detail about how these policies actually were formed, how they were enacted, how they were implemented, and what the challenges around them were. So first, let's look at some of the findings of the baseline. The survey was sent out to 30 countries in the Asia-Pacific region, and 24 countries responded. You can see the countries that responded on the slide there. That's an 80% response rate, so that's very, very high by most research standards. And the survey asked each of the country representatives through Save the Children offices and their partners in the public and the NGOs in the region who are working on CSS policy to together come up with answers about what CSS policies were in place, what funding and support was in place, and then what facilitators and blockers were present in their countries that were supporting or hindering CSS policy development and implementation. So first off, one of the most impressive themes that came out of this baseline survey was that all 24 responding countries in the Asia Pacific had both disaster management policy at the national level and education sector policy at the national level in place. Often the disaster management and education sector policies, however, lacked much integration. For instance, references in the disaster management policies to the education sector were often just very minimal. Across all the countries that were surveyed, 63% dedicated only a paragraph to the education sector, and only one country reported that they mentioned the education sector consistently through the entire disaster management policy. That country was the Philippines. So in general, while these policies existed, they existed in sort of separate realms without the linking needed between DRR policy and education sector policy. Flipping it around a little bit, we looked at whether education sector policy had any content at the national level to disaster management issues. And here we found quite a range. As I said before, all the countries had education sector policies. And most of the time, those policies were integrating some topics relevant to comprehensive school safety. For example, a majority of the 24 countries had content on safer school facilities, the first bubble on the top. Many also had school disaster management. Over 71% had school disaster management in their education sector policy. They also had lots of content on risk mitigation, on risk reduction and resilience education, and regular fire drills. So those were the sort of positive areas. But they were also weak in other areas. Across the board, there was not much. Only half of the countries had response preparedness in their education sector policies. Even fewer had teacher training in school disaster management. Only a fifth of the countries had that. And education continuity planning, something that's absolutely critical for the well-being of our children. Only 50% of the countries had education continuity planning in the education sector. The lowest sort of integration point was the role of student and youth volunteers and that disaster training in school disaster management. Now sort of diving into each, two of the pillars of comprehensive school safety. Let's look first at Pillar 1. The good news is that most of the countries surveyed have made really excellent progress developing policies that span the 3 pillars. Many countries report that they have policies addressing safe design of new school construction and safe school construction. If you look at those first 2 bubbles, 88% of the countries said when they're designing new schools, the ministries of education require that school be designed according to a building code or according to Ministry of Education template designs. Nearly the same number said that the school construction is being monitored. That's really great. But the sort of hidden problem here is that other aspects of safe learning facilities aren't as well integrated. Safe site selection, the bubble on the left, only 60%, 58% of the countries said that they had any language in their policies saying that the selection of the site for the school needs to consider hazards. And monitoring of construction was also quite low. This leads to problems in the sense of if you have a great design, but it's on a poor site or it's not monitored, it doesn't really matter that it's a safe design. So we need to get fuller integration of all 4 of those areas of policy to really be meeting the Pillar 1 Safe Learning Facilities goal. Jumping over to Pillar 3, disaster risk reduction and resilience education. Also really good news, but some areas for improvement. Asia Pacific response countries have made really good strides in incorporating DRR, resilience, and climate education into their national curriculums. 95% are saying that they've got it into their curriculum. That is absolutely astounding news, and I think something that we should all really be celebrating. On the other hand, it had yet to make it into teacher training. Less than half of the countries said they had national level policies for ensuring that this material was in their teacher development and training, either in their accreditation process or in their continuing education process. And while I have strong faith in teachers around the world and in their creativity, I do want to, we need to be supporting them to ensure that they have the resources, the knowledge, and the skills to really make that disaster risk reduction curriculum for the students excellent. In some cases, policy development for comprehensive school safety is conceived with good intentions, but lacks some of the financial resources and staff guidance and trainings. And that was sort of seriously limiting the countries in moving forward. Resource limitation was particularly evident when it came to addressing weak school facilities. This is completely understandable because this is the most expensive aspect of achieving safer school construction, of achieving comprehensive school safety. Nearly half of the countries were aware of and had policies in place for addressing structural weaknesses in school buildings. They had assessment programs in place, for instance, but often these policies lacked funding. About 40% of the countries reported that they had assessments or were in the midst of doing assessments, but they did not have any funding for implementation of the retrofitting. Financial and human resource scarcity was also evident. Lack of full-time disaster risk reduction and education in emergency staff within education authorities, and volatile or irregular funding were things that countries mentioned as some of their challenges. Less than a quarter of the countries reported that national education authorities had full-time staff dedicated to DRR or EIE. So areas for improvement, but we're well on the way towards really fully starting to see the benefits of having a comprehensive school framework and working globally in this direction. So let's look at some of the facilitators and blockers that the countries identified. All of the top facilitating factors for both policy development and implementation really revolved around advocacy and evidence. These were two very important, and they're quite logical factors for CSS policy implementation and development. So the top facilitator for policy development was countries were selecting there is strong evidence on the impact of disasters on education, the dangers of unsafe schools, and or the benefits of safer schools. 70% of the countries listed that as one of their top facilitators for developing CSS policy. Another major factor revolved around the theme of advocacy. These advocates were crucial for developing policy. They can publicize the problem, they can educate the stakeholders, and they can exert pressure on the relevant authorities. So 55% of the countries indicated that senior and mid-level disaster management officials were using their position to advance school safety publicly. A slightly less, but still high percent, were 50%, indicating that civil society groups were important, and senior level and mid-level education sector staff. That said, we looked at whether these top facilitators were, through a multivariate statistical analysis, were indicating and correlating well with policies that the countries said they had implemented. And in some senses, there is some level of correlation here. Where there was strong evidence that disasters had impacts in the education sector, there was higher rates of disaster reduction and response in the education sector policies, and there was higher levels of DRR teacher training. When it came to civil society and civil society advocating for school safety, countries where that was a top facilitator tended to have stronger comprehensive school safety policy. They were more likely to have multi-hazard assessments. They were more likely to have stronger and more robust school as temporary shelter policies, an area of particular weakness and an area we need to continue to grow in. And they were more likely to have school disaster management training. I think this is an important thing to point out because I know that many of you listening are from the civil society sector. And this is really saying that your advocacy is really helping to advance CSS policies in these countries. Now looking at some of the blockers. Countries listed many blockers, and most of it revolved around the themes of resource scarcity, either in terms of financing, technical resources, or human resources. The top blocker by far, reported by the survey respondents, was the government has not allocated sufficient funding to be able to carry out the policy activities. I'm sure you have all heard that one. The second most common blocker was the government does not have sufficient technical capacity or access to sufficient technical support for school safety. So that's an indicator of an important area for change. Other blockers were on the human resource side. 57% of the countries said, staff are too busy, there's a high turnover, and they're not paying attention to these issues. 62% said the education staff do not understand these policies. That said, while they were talking about all these blockers did not correlate with a lack of CSS policy, much to all of our surprises. Despite these countries saying, we've got these blockers, they're stopping us from developing CSS policy, most of the countries had been able to successfully implement at least some CSS policy. So, for instance, countries that said they had insufficient funding were no less likely to have policies on school disaster management, disaster risk reduction, or disaster response. They were actually more likely to have public awareness campaigns. And it's perhaps the development of these campaigns made all these advocates more acutely aware of the insufficient funding for implementing these campaigns. And implementing the policy that would improve CSS in their countries. Similarly, a lack of sufficient technical capacity meant that countries were less likely to have teacher training or curriculum on school disaster management. That seems sort of like an obvious correlation there. But when countries were saying, one of our big blockers is there's a lack of clear framework, they were actually more likely to include DRR and disaster response in education sector policy. And I think this may be that these countries, once they had the policy in place and they attempted to then go about implementing it, they realized that, like most policies, there wasn't a lot of clarity in the policy, and what they were needing most as their next step was a clearer framework for implementation. Lastly, when countries said that staff were too busy or changing too often, they were more likely to have implemented school drills, required drills, and have teacher training on school disaster management. They tended to be providing more guidance. And perhaps that correlation is just that with all that work, of course they were busy. And it's not surprising that everyone was saying, the limitations we have right now is we just need more staff to do more of what we have already started. All right, so let's look at a couple case studies. And this is where we can start to see how the top-down approach and the emergent and often groundswell of interest come together, often in sort of a push and pull and iterative process to iterate to strong policy for CSS. So the first case study I'm going to look at is in Japan, and that was the development of national policy to strengthen unsafe schools. So starting at the very beginning, Japan has very high frequency of earthquakes. We all know this. And so Japan was actually one of the first countries to mandate anti-seismic construction practices way before many other countries did, and that was in 1924. And there were incremental improvements in their building codes over the decades. But it wasn't until about 1981 that there was sort of this monumental leap in their building codes that ensured that new construction was going to be able to withstand not only small, frequent disasters, but the large, rare, high-magnitude earthquakes that Japan's so famous for. The efficacy of that change in building codes came into really sharp focus in 1995 following the Kobe earthquake. In a post-earthquake assessment of the education sector, 4,000 schools facilities were damaged, but they found a stark difference between the schools that had been built prior to 1981 and those that had been built afterwards. The ones that had been built before 1981 were more heavily damaged by far. So with that post-earthquake finding, the national government leapt into action and made retrofitting funds available to all pre-1981 public and private schools nationwide. It encouraged local governments to address the structural risks of their pre-1981 schools by commissioning construction design architects to complete seismic diagnostic, an assessment of the schools. And if the assessment indicated that retrofitting was necessary, the local government could take advantage of retrofitting subsidies from the national government. On paper, this was a great policy, but it was a top-down policy where the national government said, we've got a problem, we have a vision for what needs to happen, and we're going to support change through this subsidy program. What actually happened initially was that it flopped. Many local governments didn't comply. And the Japanese Ministry of Education, Sports, Science, and Technology, which uses the acronym MEX, found that their subsidy of covering only a third of the cost of retrofitting simply wasn't enough. Even with that subsidy, local governments saw the whole thing as super complicated and expensive, and they just weren't gonna engage with it. When MEX did a survey several years later and saw that the policy intent wasn't happening, they rethought their policy and attempted to increase policy implementation. They started by publishing and distributing guidelines that describe the basic concept of structural earthquake safety in schools, how to prioritize retrofitting projects, methods for planning and implementing retrofitting projects. And while funding was important, they realized that the local governments and schools were in great need of guidance if they were going to actually jump in and actually do this implementation. So at the same time that they provided this new guidance, they increased the support for the program. The subsidy went from covering a third of the cost to 2/3 of the cost through the enactment of the Act on Special Measures for Earthquake Disaster Countermeasures. MEX also encouraged their local governments to allocate tax revenue and issue bonds to fund the third of the project that needed local funding. So using this guidance, using the increase in the subsidies, they were able to vastly improve the outcome of this policy. They monitored progress through surveys, and the results of the survey helped MEX understand where their local municipalities were and what were the hitches in the process. And when they saw problems, they developed additional resources for the local government to overcome the obstacles, additional guidances or increases in subsidies. So through this top-down, bottom-up process of iteration, they were able to achieve success. By 2015, approximately 52,000 schools, public schools, had been successfully retrofitted, torn down or reconstructed, or assessed as safe. Between a 5-year period from 2002 to 2016, the percentage of earthquake-resistant public schools increased from 44% to 98%, an absolutely astounding success story. Where the country is working now is in the private school sector. Currently, about 15% of the private schools still need to be retrofitted or reconstructed. the national subsidy is available to the private schools, but municipal budgets are not responsible for the third local funding, matching funds. And many of the private schools simply don't have the budget to support that matching fund. So in response to this challenge, MEX is increasing subsidies for the private schools, and they do expect the rate of private school retrofitting projects to increase and reach 100% or near 100% soon. Somebody's asking how much was motivated by the Chinese earthquake. Quite a bit. It was actually 2008, but yes, quite a bit of coverage of that China earthquake and the collapse of the schools there spurred interest at the local level as well as guidance level at the national level. Jumping to Pillar 2, let's go over to the Philippines. When Typhoon Haiyan struck Southeast Asia, 2013, it affected nearly 6 million children in the Philippines, leaving thousands dead and many more traumatized. The property damage and the social disorganization left by the typhoon made the educational continuity really challenging in certain parts of the Philippines, and the disruption left children without social structure or physical place for belonging, especially where they had lost their homes or their families. The country was really challenged with orphans and separated children being especially vulnerable to risk of abuse and trafficking after the typhoon. After a month after the typhoon struck, Save the Children, World Vision, UNICEF, and Plan International began a study in December 2013, investigating the self-identified needs of children affected by Typhoon Haiyan. Part of the purpose of that study was to identify existing weaknesses in the policies in place and the effects of those weaknesses on children. Once that study was completed, there was a clear need identified, and Save the Children Philippines began investing quite heavily in policy advocacy. They developed a policy advocacy team, and the team strengthened their relationship with Congress by collaborating on the development of a bill. The team offered DRR workshops to members of Congress on the relevant House and Senate committees, and also provided Congress with copies of the research report. Save the Children took the lead in developing a draft bill in 2014 based on the data that they had gathered and analyzed. But they avoided the problem of many top-down policy interventions by carefully choosing the wording in the drafting of the bill to use local phrases that would be easily understood by local policymakers. Of course, the representatives and senators weren't going to allow just an outside organization to write a bill, so they authored their own version of the bill. A revision process took over a year, and at the same time, SAVE was advocating, continuing to apply pressure and advocate. They had working group meetings, and they were providing input and in constant communication with the relevant senators. That was working from sort of the top-down side, but they also were very strategic in creating a bottom-up support for policy intervention. They didn't leave anything to chance. They built broad community support by engaging in a media campaign and local advocacy initiatives to raise awareness about the bill and really create that outside push for passage. They convinced 30 local governments in different parts of the country to send position papers supporting the bill to lawmakers and gathered 6,000 community signatures in support of the bill, which they presented to Congress. with both that community advocacy from the bottom up and support for the top-down policy creation process. The Children's Emergency Relief and Protection Act became law in June of 2016. The Act outlines specific measures to ensure the safety of children in disasters, sort of plugging those loopholes that they had found, the policy weaknesses. It established evacuation centers. It established child and woman-friendly transitional shelters and a referral mechanism for orphaned, unaccompanied, and separated children. It had insurances for immediate delivery of basic necessities and services, stronger measures to ensure the safety and security of affected children, delivery of health, medical, and nutritional services, plans of action for promoting resumption of educational services, and establishment of child-friendly spaces that and the promotion of child rights. So Save the Children was really involved in policy advocacy, development, and implementation here, and really highlight how important researchers and partner organizations can be in partnering with the lawmakers for passage of evidence-based policy. And now I think we have time for one more. Let's look at what's been happening in Iran. In 1997, the Ministry of Education and the International Institute of Earthquake Engineering and Seismology piloted Iran's first school earthquake drill. And it was a success, and they wanted to scale up the earthquake drill to the national level, and they began a multi-decade process of doing so. IEES began holding meetings with and providing guidelines to school principals to emphasize the importance of earthquake drills for student safety. A really important part of policy is obviously first creating that awareness, so that's where they started. And in 1999, they were able to work with policymakers to ensure that the drills became mandatory for all schools in Iran. A few years later, in 2002, they established a planning council that supported schools in preparing for these drills. And by 2016, drills had been scaled up nationwide, and nearly 13 million children participated in earthquake drills across the country. They're now on their 18th national drill. What is particularly interesting about this, many countries have instituted drills, but Iran is taking it a step further. Inspired by the success in that national school drilling program, they have expanded to a broad community-based outreach through the schools. And in several pilot communities in the urban centers, they've identified schools that can withstand earthquakes. They have equipped them with response equipment, and they have held workshops and trainings with the community members there for the 3 months prior to the national earthquake drill. They engage in community risk mapping with the community, and then help the community both support the school drill and support response preparedness in the community around the school. So now, based on everything that we were seeing, the baseline survey, the 3 case studies I talked about today, as well as 7 others that we can direct you to, there are a few recommendations that come out quite strongly. First is that we need to better integrate education and disaster management policies. These policies are existing, but sometimes in too much isolation with each other. We need to address all CSS responsibilities and targets and indicators, ensuring that we have both the initial policies but the support policies in place, the funding and the resources for carrying out those policies. And we need to better include teachers and students in this process. If you'll remember back to some of the earlier slides, youth participation is some of the lowest levels of integration and an area for real improvement going forward. Fourthly, we need to be investing in technical and human resources. Many countries are saying we've got the policies, but at this point we're hampered by that lack of technical and human resources. And lastly, this is a baseline study. It's tantalizing and interesting, but we're going to need to create longitudinal evidence. We're going to need to go back to countries in the coming years and see how policy is changing and deepening, and how support is improving, and track it over time so that we can see where our successes are really being met and where the existing challenges remain. And in that sense, I'll just throw out that I am working with a graduate student now to do the global assessment. I've been talking right now about just the Asia Pacific countries, but there's 65 countries in total globally that took this baseline assessment, and we will be coming out with the evidence from that survey for the globe in the next year. And with that, I will turn it over to questions.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. So now we have questions. If we can't answer your question today because it requires us going back and having a look at the data, we'll collate all of those and send them out after. Rebecca, while you've been talking, a couple of questions came up, so I might just go to them first. There was one from Els, which Els was asking, how does all of this link to government's commitment to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and, for example, the regional technical working group activities led by UNESCO and UNICEF in the Asia Pacific region?
That's a really good question. The survey itself did not ask about sustainable development goals or any linkages. There are linkages that we can all see on the theoretical level, and so I think that's an excellent way for improving the survey, and we should sort of jot that idea down. And the next iteration of the survey, we should be asking questions around development goals, sustainable development goals as well.
And just adding to that, there were a couple of comments which might also help improve the survey. So Els also said it would be interesting to know whether the policies used an inclusive lens throughout. And also,
Yes.
Also Nadia mentioned it would be interesting to know how much of a push do the regional and global policies have for the development of national or country policies?
Mm-hmm. I think we can go both ways with that. I think we can ask how much is the global framework and how much is the global push supporting national level, and how much is the national level supporting subnational and regional policy development, especially in countries that are federated.
Absolutely, lots of great suggestions. And then Nia was asking about whether you saw any differences between WIS countries and non-WIS countries in the data.
Well, fortunately, no. And I say fortunately because in the Asia Pacific, the number of countries who were WIS countries was so high that there wasn't really much of a comparison to non-WIS countries. I think that when we get to the global data set, we'll have a better data set for answering that question.
So there are all the questions and comments that came up through the presentation. If you'd like to ask your question, please just write your name in the instant message box there, or feel free to type it and I'll read it out. I can see that there's quite a few people typing, and while they are, Rebecca, I've got a question for you. Under the big research program that we're running at Save the Children, we're starting to generate a lot of evidence on hazard impacts on education and solutions for child-centred DRR and school safety. What is your advice for practitioners with regards to how they can use the guidance products, so for example the reports and the summaries, to influence the policies?
A couple of things. We know that, especially in this realm, that there are very short windows of opportunity for changing policy, and those windows tend to come right after major disasters in your country or in countries nearby, such as when Japan was able to capitalize on the heightened awareness after the Sichuan earthquake in China. That said, that window of opportunity is the most challenging time to start thinking about what new policies you want, or what new policies you need. So one thing I would suggest is, in the calm before the disaster, look through the case studies for policies that are particularly relevant or identify gaps in your country, and dig into it a little deeper so that you can come with draft ideas, draft policies, good case studies to your policymakers in that window of opportunity. The other thing that the evidence is really clearly showing is that the most effective means of getting policy implemented is having a tripartite of advocates, a strong leader and advocate within the NDMO, a strong advocate and leader within the education sector and the Ministry of Education, and then a strong outside organization that is serving as a civil society advocate. And when all three of those are present, we're seeing the most movement. So developing those relationships now is, I think, the best place to start.
Thank you. And all the case studies are on the GADRIS website, so everyone can access them and begin planning for those windows of opportunity. We've got a question. I see that it's now on the 1 hour mark. So those that need to go, please feel free to log out. But Rebecca has kindly offered to stay another 30 minutes for discussion. So I encourage you to stay on and continue to ask your questions. I can see there's a question around, did this study consider the gender perspectives of comprehensive school safety, for example, commitment, capacity and role on DRR between female, male, in school setting or at community level?
It did not, and I think that is a lovely flaw to have pointed out, and a great place to think about where we can improve the next baseline or the next reiteration of this survey. Certainly one area that we could immediately be asking is whether they are collecting gender disaggregated data about disaster impacts to their students and staff in the education sector. That would be immediate. But additionally, especially around wash facilities in safer school facilities. We could be asking gender-related questions and inclusion of genders and ages and children with disabilities in the school disaster management. We didn't get to that level of detail with this survey, and I think those are excellent places for expansion next round.
Great. I can see a couple of people are still typing there. Did anyone want to ask their question over the microphone?
Yes, please.
Oh, go for it, Nick.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks a lot for a fantastic presentation. That was really great. And it's really fantastic to see the data so clearly laid out. It really paints a picture that I think we've never been able to see before in terms of where things are moving in policy and practice in school safety. Two questions, if I may. One of them is really around, I can't remember what the first slide said in how many people responded and didn't, but would it be fair to assume that the countries that didn't respond are likely to have had less systems and structures in place, or does it maybe mean nothing more than it didn't get to the right person? And the second question, if I may, was around, was there any evidence through the survey that success breeds success? In as much as you kind of alluded to it on the Iran case study, when something goes well or they feel a government, a school, a community can see that what they're doing is relevant and efficient use of time and resources, that they're likely to engage in greater investments in different aspects of school safety.
So the first question might actually be one that Kate can answer, but I'll attempt to answer it. I didn't do any of the data collection or writing of this survey instrument. So I have a ton of gripes with the survey, and I'm going to rewrite it if you let me. But from what Kate has told me, the surveys were not sent out just randomly to these countries. They were sent out specifically to places where Save the Children had strong staff support and the ability to fill out the survey. So in that sense, yes, I think we're biasing towards countries that have more CSS policy than the countries who simply were not sent the survey in the first place. So yes, on that front. In terms, does success breed success? That is such an interesting question. My graduate student is going to take it on at the global data set level and going to perform a particular policy analysis. The name is escaping me now because it's so late at night here. That is going to look and see if there's an ordering of how of policies being implemented. Is there a certain policy that sort of needs to happen first before the next policy comes into play? And is there an ordering that we're seeing in the data set? And if so, that'll be incredibly helpful to know, because then we'll know for countries that are just starting this out, here's where you start and get this first success, this small, the low-hanging fruit, and then here's your next step, and here's the step afterwards, and we'll be able to sort of direct a policy implementation plan that's been most successful in these countries where success has been achieved for longer. But I don't have the answers yet.
This is Marla. I just want to add a note to the responding countries versus non-responding. Many of the non-responding are simply countries where we didn't have Save the Children offices, some smaller countries that we deliberately did not prioritize, Singapore, Brunei Darussalam, and so forth. And then some of the smaller Pacific countries. So I don't think, it probably mostly means it's biased against smaller countries. Anthony,
thanks for your comment in the side about safety the specific gendered safety issues in Afghanistan as well as other areas of the globe, and in conflict settings where safety is very, very gendered. Those are good places to add additional questions to the survey for the next round.
I have a question from Bryony here. You mentioned the importance of increasing the involvement of children and youth. Have you identified any potential pathways or platforms through which this might occur?
Not in the data set, but there are extensive levels of expertise in the participants here. Save the Children, UNICEF, many of these organizations have got really good child-centered policies and practices in place for engaging with youth in identifying, especially around school disaster management, Pillar 2. I think that there's a lot of room for having students be involved in the identification of risks that from their perspectives, and involvement in the planning and carrying out of school disaster management drills and responses, as well as child-centered DRR education that is child-led.
I think that's all the questions that have been asked. Does anyone have anything else, or would they like to jump in and ask Rebecca a question?
I do have to say, everyone,
as if somebody's taking notes for modifications of the survey in next round, a request from Save the Children internationally to kindly include looking at whether there's policy on attacks against schools or military use of schools, maybe the signatories to the Safe Schools Declaration, which is something easy to pull up. And also whether there's any policy on interpersonal violence, from corporal punishment to bullying and so forth, which is, as we take a child-centered approach, we're trying to cover all of our bases. So that would also be quite valuable to know.
Yeah, just looking at the conversation happening on the sidelines here, I think we've got all kinds of really strong ideas for expanding and making the survey more nuanced for the next round.
Looking forward to writing that proposal.
I told my graduate student that her final chapter of her thesis needed to be a rewrite of the survey. So we'll get a good start on that process at the end of this year.
Fabulous.
That's fantastic, and perhaps we can hold another webinar or something with all the school safety partners to feed into that.
Yeah, I think this needs to be a consensus process of building the next version of the survey, because we have so many different things happening in different contexts that we should be considering.
Excellent. Any last questions before we wrap it up? I think that's all. Oh, I can see Nick is typing. Please go
Hello,
ahead.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, it's Rifat from Bangladesh, PDQ director. I think I missed the earlier part of the presentation. Sorry for that. Thanks very much for the presentation. It sounded very interesting. Two questions, basically. One is that I like the recommendation about the integration between education and disaster management in terms of the policies. That's one recommendation. But my question is that what's your reflection about how to integrate that? Because within SAVE even it's very difficult to integrate between different sectors. And on the governance side, the governance system, the way it's structured in our country, for example, in Bangladesh, education and disaster ministry is very different. So how do you see, to what extent the governance system, not only policies, but the structures and systems and procedures are conducive to facilitate this integration that we are expecting? And the second question is about the online violence. Because
can we do the first question and then do the second question so I don't forget your first question?
Okay, no problem.
So in terms of your first question, yes, these are traditionally siloed sectors, and NDMOs and ministries of education traditionally don't talk to each other at all. Again, I see an incredible role for civil society there, to be that go-between and to nurture and foster and identify the advocate within the NDMOs that are interested in and willing to push their organizations to look at education sector issues, and at the same time find the people in the education sector that are willing to look at not just the everyday curriculum and running of schools, but what are we going to do when schools are impacted by disasters. Then creating a comprehensive school safety consortium at the national level that brings in the NDMO, brings in the civil society, brings in the advocates, and brings in the Ministry of Education to sit down together and look at comprehensive school safety using the CSS framework has proven to be very successful in Nepal, in the Philippines, and in many other countries.
Thank you.
I'd like to also add a quick mention that the CSS targets and indicators that GADRIS developed, actually, I think there's one of the indicators you mentioned, Rebecca, is the existence of a national coordination mechanism, which of course exists in Bangladesh as well, but the frequency that meets is also important. And the other thing that was identified, and I think again we should be, I think this was in the survey actually, but we could investigate a bit more, is the idea of asking the NDMO to name a specific person as the education sector focal point, and for the education sector to name a specific person as the DRR focal point. Because this is really anecdotal observation that when you have those two focal points and you can talk to them on a regular basis, that there, a true engagement begins. And those are the people that you then invite to capacity building meetings and regional meetings, and they present, and it sort of goes on and on. I think it goes on from there. So that would be another hypothesis to throw in.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And then you had a second question?
Yeah, I mean, there was a discussion about the violence in school setting. So I was wondering whether in the next round, you're also considering looking at the online violence, which is increasingly, it is increasing day by day. So any thoughts around that?
Looking to see if governments had created policy to address online bullying.
Yes, within the school setting. I mean, it's online, but it's still in the school level, age group, looking at those aspects as well.
I think you're bringing up an excellent point. I think, here in the United States, we've got that in spades, starting with our president all the way down. And we are struggling here with developing any kind of policy around that. So I think, yes, we should be surveying and finding out if anyone has even started to think about developing policy. I think we're at the point now where we have that emergent concern at the bottom up. Students are concerned, parents are concerned, teachers are concerned, but we have yet to see that emerging as strong policy.
I'd like to mention some news from Save the Children, which is evolving a common approach to school safety. And for Save the Children, that common approach to school safety, it really would like to make it clear that we want to include interpersonal violence as well as attacks on schools. And so I'm curious if there's anybody else from UNICEF and Plan International on the line, whether that would be, well regarded by them as well.
I think our UNICEF and Plan colleagues had to head off, but certainly a question we can ask when we go to looking at the next iteration of the survey. Does anyone else have any final questions? I'm going to take the silence as that's all.
And I'll just go to the last slide, which I think has the link for where you can get full access to all of the case studies, the full report, and various other research to practice briefs as they are emerging.
Excellent. So thank you, Rebecca, for such an engaging and insightful presentation. I know a lot of people have really appreciated it. There's been a lot of great feedback in the comments as you've been talking, which I'll share with you so you can read it after. And thank you for staying the extra time. As Rebecca has mentioned, all of this will be available on the GADRIS website there. And I will share the PowerPoint presentation and a PDF of the presentation as well in the coming days. So thank you, Rebecca, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join the webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day.
And thank you to everyone who had comments. Excellent fodder for moving forward.